Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the IMO Singapore Future of Shipping webinar on decarbonization. We are pleased and grateful for the overwhelming response. We have close to 1,200 registrations from 109 countries, including decision makers in governments and industry, from shipping companies to solution providers to financiers, as well as students and the academia. Thank you for joining us, albeit virtually. We are pleased to have the Minister for Transport of Singapore, Mr. Ong Ye Kung, and the IMO Secretary General, Mr. Kitak Lim, open today's webinar. Without further ado, may I invite Minister Ong to give his opening remarks, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Ong Heng. Very happy to join everyone at today's webinar. I was appointed Singapore's Minister for Transport only in July. It's about 2 months ago, amidst a very unprecedented global crisis. Maritime is quite new to me as a sector. So I spent the last 2 months getting to know the sector, speaking to industry leaders, and also dealing with some urgent issues. One of the urgent issues is crew change, as many of you will know. It is not just an economic issue, but a humanitarian one. Singapore has now set up a dedicated facility at our Tanjong Pagar terminal. We use floating accommodation to hold crew members. The numbers we can handle safely are steadily going up, and we hope this will provide much needed relief to seafarers and also the shipping lines. To support crew change effort on the international stage, the Maritime Port Authority of Singapore, the Singapore Shipping Association, and local seafarer unions, we have set up a fund. It's called the SG Star Fund, Singapore Shipping Tripartite Alliance Resilience Fund, SG Star. So we can use the fund to support the setting up of COVID-19 testing facilities in countries such as India or the Philippines. The International Transport Workers Federation, International Maritime Employers Council, and International Chamber of Shipping have also come aboard this fund. So that's very encouraging. But despite my unfamiliarity with the sector, a couple of fundamentals are clear to me. First, maritime is the lifeblood of Singapore. As a nation, we are young, 55 years old, but as a regional and global economic entity, we have survived over 700 years. And throughout that period, we built up a very rich maritime history because this is a geographical fact for us. Today, the narrow straits of Malacca and Singapore continues to funnel through 1/3 of world trade. The dynamism and energy of a growing Asia and a globalized world converges here. It's like a laser beam, converges here. And you capture that energy, and Singapore will continue to prosper and bring good jobs and opportunities for our people. Second fundamental is, if we are a small city-state and our hinterland is the region and the world, then it naturally follows that we cannot do without the international rule of law and the strong system of global governance. Whether it is the United Nations, the WTO, or the ICAO, or the IMO, they are all an integral and indispensable part of this system. The IMO in particular, amongst its many functions, sets the agenda for the maritime world, brings stakeholders together, and put in place regulations and standards that make everything work in the maritime world. Because of the IMO's importance since 1993, Singapore sought elections to the IMO Council. Very thankfully, we enjoy the support of many of our friends and partners. As a result, we are very privileged to be able to serve in the IMO Council all these years, watching firsthand and contributing continuously to the evolution and development of this global industry. We take our responsibility very seriously, One area which we can contribute and we have been contributing is training and assistance, especially in the area of safe navigation and environmental protection. Over the years, we provided training and assistance to over 2,500 individuals from 126 IMO member states through the Singapore IMO Third Country Training Program and the MPA Academy. Being so dependent on the maritime economy as a city-state, port state, flag state, and coastal state, we are also in a unique position to speak our minds, contribute in a pragmatic and balanced manner at various IMO bodies to move discussions forward. One important agenda item that we are deeply involved in is today's webinars, the theme of today's webinar, and which is decarbonization. Decarbonization is a major plank of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change agenda. As a small, low-lying city-state, Singapore is particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and tackling it is a matter of national priority. To give you a sense of the gravity of the situation that we face, by year 2100, mean sea level around us is expected to rise by up to 1 meter because of the melting of the two poles. At high tides, the water can rise as high as 2 meters above mean sea level. And if we take into account storms, tide surges, sea levels could rise even further. So we may become an Amsterdam of the equator. So climate change is a problem we cannot solve alone, especially when Singapore accounts for only 0.1% of global carbon emissions. Even if there's zero emission by Singapore, we still cannot move the global climate change needle. But what we can do here can be a useful reference for the rest of the international community, and that makes us a potential catalyst for change. Indeed, we have been a pioneer in some areas of sustainable development. Today, to the best of my knowledge, Singapore is the only country where we control the growth of private vehicles and motorcycles population at 0%. We are alternate energy disadvantaged, but we did the next best thing. So since the early 2000s, we have progressively switched fuel for electricity generation from oil to natural gas, which is the cleanest form of fossil fuel. Notwithstanding our urban constraints, we are building up renewable energy sources by installing floating large-scale solar panels in our reservoirs and in the sea off our shorelines. We are also the first country in Southeast Asia to implement a carbon tax applied economy-wide with no exceptions. Despite being, and perhaps because we are a city-state with limited land, we set aside extensive space for natural reserves and public parks. We implement extensive forest and mangrove restoration plans as a buffer to incoming tides. And today, nearly half of all our land is covered in green. So equivalent efforts need to be replicated in the area of shipping by the maritime community. Here we have relevant and important capabilities. First, we are developing sustainable port infrastructure. The Tuas Port, which will be completed in the 2040s, will be the world's largest fully automated terminal, and will be here in Singapore. Its capacity is almost twice the number of TEUs we handle today, but at about half the carbon emission intensity compared to 2005 levels. The new Tuas Port will have a fleet of fully electric automated guided vehicles to transport containers within the port premises. They will replace the conventional diesel-operated prime movers. We are actively encouraging vessels which call at our ports to use cleaner fuels, such as LNG, by providing them with port dues concessions and co-funding building of LNG-fueled bunker tankers. We are also exploring the electrification of our hovercrafts. Second, we will leverage our offshore and marine manufacturing capabilities. Over the past 2 decades, our offshore and marine companies produced about 60% of the world's FPSOs and 30% of the world jackup rigs. As global energy mix shifts, the capability can be reapplied to green solutions, such as dual fuel LNG carriers, fabrication of wind turbine foundations and substations. Third area, we need to continue to work on decarbonization solutions. Singapore has set up the Maritime Green Future Fund to support the industry in R&D, test bedding, and adoption of green fuels and technologies. We are working with universities and activating the resources of venture capital partners. Fourth, as a maritime center, we will bring together key players, ship owners, operators, brokers, insurers, legal and arbitration professionals, technology players, to develop sustainable solutions for the sector. Recently, we established an international advisory panel on maritime decarbonization to propose policies and solutions. We cannot leave this historic human endeavor to a patchwork of individual efforts. The IMO's leadership is needed to harness the collective will of the maritime community. It has spearheaded some critical initiatives, such as the first set of regulations for a global sector on CO2 emission standards for new ships, setting collective ambition by 2050 and within this century. None of us will be spared the effects of climate change. It is an existential threat to mankind. While the world deals with the COVID-19 crisis, it must keep up with the fight against climate change. No one can do this alone. It is a global ambition to be accomplished by the international maritime community. But we all have capabilities, expertise, and resources to contribute to this endeavor. And Singapore will do our part, and we look forward to the maritime community coming together under the leadership of the IMO to redouble our efforts to build a better and a greener world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Next, Secretary General Lim will give his opening remarks.
Distinguished participants and ladies and gentlemen, my thanks go to Minister Ong Ye Kung and to the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore for organizing jointly with the IMO the Maritime Perspective Future of Shipping webinar series. We are living through unprecedented times in which the ability for shipping services to deliver vital goods is central to responding to and overcoming this pandemic. Sustainable development is the key to the post-COVID recovery, and shipping will be at the heart of that. But the shipping also needs to be secure its own sustainability. There can be little doubt that the single biggest challenge we are still facing is the battle against the global warming and the climate change. IMO has adopted a detailed initial strategy to achieve decarbonization with clear goals and ambitions. Most importantly, the goal is to reduce the total annual GHG emissions by at least 50% by 2050 compared to 2008, which means a reduction of over 80% of carbon intensity for individual ships. At the same time, IMO is pursuing efforts to phase out GHG emissions from shipping entirely as soon as possible within this century. One thing is very certain: new technologies, new fuels, and innovation will be vital to meet the ambitious target of the IMO strategy. While research into zero carbon marine fuels is underway, with electricity, hydrogen, ammonia, or biofuels considered viable options, more action is needed to speed up this process. This requires huge investment, notably in R&D and infrastructure development. To achieve this, IMO is stepping up its efforts to act as a global forum and promoter of R&D in zero-carbon marine fuels, bringing together interested stakeholders from public and private sectors, but also private and development bank and other potential donors from around the world. In this context, we look forward to the discussion during next MEPC, Marine Environment Protection Committee, on the ambitious proposal on the International Maritime Research and Development Board, IMRB. In parallel, IMO will embark on emission reduction mechanism like a market-based measure to incentivize the uptake of alternative renewable fuels. We also want to ensure that no country is left behind in the transition to carbon-neutral shipping. IMO continues to lead the way with a portfolio of continuously expanding technical cooperation and capacity building for developing countries. You'll hear more on IMO decarbonization-related initiatives from head of IMO Department of Partnership and Project, who will introduce Next Gen, a concept for a collaborative global ecosystem of maritime decarbonization initiatives. IMO is firmly determined to progress on our major policy issues despite the challenges posed by COVID-19. We are committed to keep up the momentum for implementing GHG strategy. We will hold, by means of virtual meeting under this pandemic situation, the Special Working Group on Reduction of GHG Emissions from Ships in October, followed by MEPC in November, which will postpone from the first half of this year. I would like to conclude, though, by calling on all IMO member states and the stakeholders to continue their constructive cooperation on the implementation of IMO GHG strategy and the short-term GHG reduction measure in particular, and so that when we meet again in November, IMO can demonstrate its leadership in reducing GHG emissions from shipping in the shape of a solid set of amendments to MARPOL Annex 6. If we all work together, we can ensure that shipping has a truly sustainable, decarbonized future.
Well, thank you, Secretary General. I think we now follow very naturally with the first presenter. Jules from the IMO will give us an overview of IMO's decarbonization initiatives. Jules, please.
Honorable Minister of Transport, Mr. Ong, Secretary General, Mr. Lim, eminent panelists and speakers, moderator, and ladies and gentlemen from all over the world. A good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I know that there are people who have woken up before 4 a.m. in the morning and staying beyond the midnight in other parts of the world. I'm extremely honored and extremely humbled to see this level of participation in this webinar, which gives me the optimism that we are not alone in this fight against climate change and that all of you are behind it. Today, I will be talking about IMO's initiatives and some new actions as well. And this is a long timeline, if you could see, which started in 1997, when shipping sector was one of the first sectors to recognize carbon dioxide emissions as an issue and pass a solution. Since then, a number of developments happened, and I will not go into all that. The Minister and Secretary General talked about the strategy, etc. But just to highlight, we had a significant development in 2013 when the world adopted the MARPOL Annex 6 that regulated energy efficiency requirement for the ships. Along the way, then came a resolution on encouraging ports to contribute as well. And then came the most significant development of the world adopting the initial GHG strategy for shipping, with an ambitious target of reducing at least 50% of the emissions by 2050 and phasing out the emissions as soon as possible or within the century. So a very ambitious timeline that IMO has set there, and a lot of development has taken place. However, as you probably would, many of you would know, that the design and operational measures alone will not take us to the target 2050. It can reduce emissions to a certain extent, but as you look into the graph there, you can see it needs more measures and fuel solutions and technologies to achieve the target. So there are developments around the world looking into those solutions, and various options are there. Some are developing, some are mature, and hopefully a mix of the solutions would take us to the target. I'm not going to details about this. You have very eminent speakers in the next sessions to talk about some of these options. But all what I would like to say is we would need a mix of these options to reach those targets, and we need those innovations and development. I would like to highlight the one thing in the IMO strategy, where a special emphasis is given to the needs of the developing countries, in particular the least developed countries and the SIDS, the small island development states, where they have a very specific need for capacity building and technical cooperation, and we need to address it so that nobody is left behind. The strategy also talks about private sector partnership and mechanisms for information exchange and collaboration. And it is in this context, I would like to outline some of the work that we did or are doing right now in IMO. The first thing that comes to my mind is the GLOW-MEET project, which was a very humble initiative, a pilot phase, supported by the GEF and UNDP, with strategic partners such as Singapore and others, where we focused on legal and policy reforms in some of the countries, capacity building, and of course, a private sector partnership that resulted in some very impressive outcomes in terms of the tools and the capacity building initiatives. But I'm very excited about this particular outcome from that project is the launch of a global industry alliance to support the low carbon shipping, where a number of champion industry companies came together behind this goal to work together to develop solutions to address this issue. And that collaboration is still going on. Then came last year, where we had a significant funding from Norway to launch a new flagship project for IMO, the Green Voyage 2050 project. And you can see the signing ceremony between Secretary General and Norway, which will build on the project that we did before. We will continue to look into the legal and policy reforms and capacity building, but a significant attention will be given to the technology cooperation, innovation, and demonstration so that these solutions can be uptaken as early as possible. But individual projects such as this have limited impact in a certain region, countries, and hence we do need a network of efforts around the world. So one of the first initiatives was the European Union funded project and worked with IMO to establish 5 centers of excellence around the world, and we call it Maritime Technology Cooperation Centers. It was a very ambitious target to establish the centers in a few years' time, but we achieved it. We have a center for the Caribbean in Trinidad and Tobago. We have one in Africa and Kenya, one in Asia in China, and one in Pacific in Fiji, and one in Latin America in Panama. And these centers have been established to promote technology cooperation. Moving on, we would like to promote innovation. As you heard from the Secretary General, this is key to reach our goals. And we will be organizing a Maritime Innovation Forum next year with support from Norway and UNEP. And coming back to the SIDS and LDCs specific needs, we are just about to embark on a project on training these countries on GHG emissions and the GHG strategy. And we are hoping to kickstart this project very soon for the next 5 years, providing training to the countries in the SIDS and the LDCs. And then comes to an interesting concept, which was actually a bit of a missing puzzle, piece of this puzzle, the financial tools and the financial instrument and the financial flow to support low carbon solutions. And this is where IMO is currently discussing the number of financial institutions, especially the multilateral development banks, to bring a roundtable to discuss about financial options. And we are about to kickstart this initiative. So please watch this space on this FinSmart roundtable. And that brings me to the new concept that Sekjen mentioned before, is the next generation network, a collaborative effort of all the initiatives that we would like to conceptualize, and the initiatives conceptualized between IMO and Singapore, where we hope that we can bring all these initiatives around the world. A lot of good initiatives happening, but we need to connect them together, and that's what the next gen is planning to do. So first of all, the next gen would facilitate the information flow between these initiatives around the world. Very excellent initiative. Some of you are going to hear about it very soon in this webinar. And then once we bring all these initiatives together, then collaboration opportunities emerge from this dialogue and this, this platform. And we are hoping to promote those collaboration between the initiatives and creating this global network and create an organic ecosystem of decarbonization initiatives that all work together and synchronize together for better results. So how are we going to do this? We will settle in the stage right now, talking to all of you, and we will continue this dialogue until the next year, early for the Singapore conference. And then we will move on to map out this ecosystem, not just technologies, but also any initiatives, legal policy, financial initiatives, capacity building initiatives, everything can be brought together and map it out and see where do we stand in terms of the ecosystem. And then we can identify the complementary strengths in that ecosystem and then build on the strength and also some gaps where we can fill. And that will provide a common platform eventually for promoting this collaboration. And that is NextGen is all about. So in terms of timeline, we hope to do that in the next 2.5 years time. With this webinar starting, you are the first to know about this concept right now. It is just introduced and is mooted now. And we'll continue this dialogue to the next year conferences and eventually the formal meetings. And by 2022, we are hoping that we will have a fully developed next-gen platform where we can bring all the initiatives around the table to promote collaboration. And I'm very excited about this at IMO. We are all excited along with Singapore to make it happen. So there is my last slide, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for this. As Secretary General mentioned, together, if you stand together, we can achieve these goals and you can bring the smile to the children, to the fishermen, and preserve this ecosystem, the coral reefs. And your commitment today and your being here today is a vote of confidence that, yes, we can do it together, and we look forward to it. Thank you very much, moderator. Back to you.
Well, thank you, Jose. Good to hear of the many activities in the maritime decarbonization space led by the IMO. We certainly look forward to more details on IMO's NextGen initiative and how we can all participate in it. We now aptly go on to the first panel to discuss what more is needed to enable international shipping to decarbonize to meet IMO's 2050 goal. Let me welcome Lei Hun, Andreas, and Wing San. Now, to kick off the discussion, I would like to ask each of the panelists to share their views on the decarbonization of international shipping. Andreas, please.
Thank you. Well, to start at a high level, it's necessary in order to mitigate climate change. It's clear in terms of our goals for 2030 and 2050. It's possible for our industry, in part because we have a global regulator in IMO. And it's exciting because there are a lot of initiatives already underway. But just to zoom in on one critical area for decarbonization, clearly low carbon fuels will be the only way we can reach the higher level objective. And to frame this, there are three types. There are affordable, available, somewhat lower carbon fuels, and these are gases like LNG and LPG. There's a second bucket which is much lower carbon but not yet sufficiently available. And these are drop-in fuels like biofuels and methanol. We can maybe add batteries in here too, although more for short sea. And then there's this third bucket, which a lot of people are talking about, zero carbon. But this is difficult to handle, it's expensive, it's not readily available as a ship fuel today, for instance, hydrogen and ammonia. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because we have to think about time spans. I'm not saying these fuels won't come, but it's going to take time. And just to give an example of hydrogen, Bloomberg estimates at a global level that by 2050, we will need $11 trillion of investment, 12 terawatts of renewables, 8 terawatts of electrolyzers to meet just 20% of the world's energy needs, and it will still be more expensive than natural gas today. So in conclusion, I think there are these tremendous opportunities, but it needs substantial investment, it needs global regulation to help close the gap, and then it needs collaboration amongst players. And I'm very encouraged to hear, as we're discussing today, that there's lots of evidence on this last one. Maybe more is needed on funding and global regulation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andreas. May I now invite Wing San to share his views?
Yeah, thank you. I think shipping, as we all know, is the backbone of global economy. It is till now by far the most efficient mode of freight transportation, serving 80% of the world trade volume. Therefore, we all will know that faster action is required to meet global climate change target. But however, there is a situation whereby, as Andreas mentioned just now, there are various data points. But however, if this can be done well, this could be an opportunity for us to transform the shipping industry through the well-coordinated, manageable, and practical solution that could accelerate decarbonization. I think in process, we are looking at what will be the end point where it is really able to have a very carbon efficient or zero carbon fuel. But to make this happen, right, and make it faster, it really requires a lot of collaboration with the key stakeholders within the industry itself, and which also required to across the broader shipping ecosystem and across the energy supply chain. I think all the consumer, producer, manufacturer, policymaker, we all know has a role to play and to contribute to support. But it can only be through a strong collaboration initiative. And technical apart, I think collaborations through the steps, through a transition period to achieve decarbonization is critically important. Is my view.
Well, thank you very much, Wing San. May I now turn to Lei Hun to share her views?
Thanks, Yap. I'll just build on what Andreas and Wing San have mentioned. I just wanted to first raise one point that actually we do not have a long timeline. 2050 looks far away, but actually if we were to work backwards, we actually need commercially viable solutions along the whole value chain within the next few years. And this actually means that less than a decade for us to get our act together. But I have to say that there are actually some good initiatives around. So my view is this: we need to do more on 3 key areas. The first area is we actually need all these initiatives now to snowball. It should not be seen as individual initiative competing with each other, but actually we can build on each other's experience to make it a better success. So having webinars like that, the proposal that we have, which IMO is working with Singapore on the Next Gen initiative, we hope that this will create that snowball effect so that we can all share our experiences and it can trigger a call solution soon. Second area, it really is about having more joint industry projects. I think we talk about, Andreas talked about the 3 possible areas, and for when it comes to zero carbon, the solution is still nowhere, we are not seeing the end of the tunnel yet. And it could well be that we may need a few pilot projects to go along the whole value chain, like what Wing San mentioned. We need projects on bio-LNG, we need projects on carbon capture, we need projects on ammonia, we need projects on hydrogen, we need projects on renewable. Then we also need projects not just on the transportation and conversion or bunkering, we also need projects on the storage. So there are a lot of projects that I think we need to really we can learn from each other across the whole value chain. So I agree, funding is important. Singapore, we have come up with a Maritime Green Future Fund, and I think companies have put aside R&D fund. So I think we just need more of like-minded partners who are able to come on board to start doing that. The third key area, of course, is standard and policies. Indeed, I think as a global hub port, we do want to get ourselves ready for whatever future ships that are ready, that will be coming on board. So it actually requires, first and primordial for me in Singapore, is a network of bunkering nodes among the ports. So this includes harmonization and implementation of standards. So if I were to look at the example of LNG, right? We started the LNG bunkering focus group in 2014. It took us a few years before the LNG bunkering standards is harmonized into a global standards, ISO standards. So I think if we were to work backwards again, so if you want to receive an alternative ship by 2030, this would mean that we actually have to start work now on what are the bunkering standards. So with that, we are open to, we will start talking to some port authorities and like-minded port authorities as well to sort of build on whatever we have done in terms of experience on LNG to start working on potential future fuel type of bunkering, whether it's ammonia or whether it's hydrogen or whether it's bio-LNG. So I think we need these three key areas. Time is running out. We need to really act fast. Secondly, we need whoever can to speed up and joint industry project, whoever has the fund to chip in the fund. And thirdly, we need the authorities to also come together, perhaps to start looking at the bunkering standards, but there could be other standards we need to work together as well.
I think we have heard from Lei Hun with regards to the need to accelerate the decarbonization of shipping in order to meet IMO's 2050 goal. Perhaps now I can ask Andreas and Wing San, representing the industry, to perhaps share with us what you see are the main challenges and opportunities, and what do you think would be useful or necessary from the industry's viewpoint for the acceleration of this transition of international shipping to low to zero carbon. Again, I will ask Andreas to start off. Andreas, please.
Okay, so maybe I'll just mention 3 challenges and 3 opportunities, and I'll start with the opportunities first because it's more positive note. One, I think, is really to leverage our industry's capabilities in technology and engineering to help reduce our environmental footprint. And as we all know, there aren't silver bullets for this, whether one's talking about operational processes like just-in-time arrival or slow steaming, or one's talking about design efficiencies and so on. There are just so many pathways that we need to work on in parallel. The second opportunity is to lead the way on a carbon levy, because we have this unique entity in IMO, and of course, one can frame it as R&D contributions, if not as a levy, but to help to bridge the price gap and to do so on a global basis. And maybe, later we might hear about what's happening in Europe, but it is, it's very difficult for the industry if we have this patchwork legislation. The third opportunity, I think we've talked about, but to create new fuels, which can actually be applied across other industries beyond shipping. So it's not just about what can we do for shipping, but if we can create fuels which we can store and transport around the world, we can actually deploy this in other industries. On challenges, we've mentioned the cost gap and we've mentioned collaboration, so I won't go into too much detail. I guess, just to give a bit more flavor, the challenge with the cost gap is actually the industry has been operating on low margins for a very long time. So it's been a decade since 2008, over a decade, that the industry has done badly overall. And that makes this cost challenge particularly pertinent. On the stakeholders, just maybe again to give a bit more example, ship owners can't implement new fuels without the help of engine makers, shipbuilders, fuel suppliers, governments, and infrastructure builders. You need all these pieces to come together in order to be able to make it work. And the last challenge I'll mention here is, again, echoing maybe what Lei Hoon was saying about standards. We need proper accounting and measurements, because the danger is if we don't measure the right things and we don't measure them correctly, we'll head off in the wrong direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andres. Very useful points. May I have Wing Sun to share on this?
Yeah, thank you. I will talk about challenges first. I think the main challenge is still the technical solution, leading to a new substitute for marine fossil fuel. And that also in tandem need to build capabilities to overcome capacity constraint, and even new engine development or phasing out existing combustion engine. So the new fuel supply chain, especially the accessibility. So these are the challenges we ought to focus to find a solution to it. And therefore, until that we achieve a zero carbon emission state, how can investment be available to support R&D and infrastructure? And I would say that this is not a shipping sector alone problem, and it should be also involved in a much global cross-border scheme of things. And also how the incentive and financing scheme available to actually support the different level, the needs within the sector itself as well. And for the operation side today, we can say that the shipping community is experiencing increasing pressure to decarbonize its practices and operation. It will definitely have a short-term impact, further impact on asset costs and reducing earning capacity, while transiting into zero carbon state, which could be from mid to long term. And the current post-COVID situation, slow recovery, geopolitical development, uncertain energy policies, and also different pace of development, generally not as fast as we wish to have, and also the high pricing, especially in the immature technologies, and such challenges remain for maritime stakeholders who has still must stay focused to navigate into the future with very informed decision to be made. I think on the opportunity side, I would say that other than the expedited technology development may yield greater improvement in energy efficiency, but however, we can also think that working towards decarbonization target or zero emission can emerge as an opportunity to transform the sector and to be the main influencer to the global supply chain to improve efficiency, response time, reduce wastages, and help to improve shipping carbon reduction rate and improve the profitability. And this is possible especially when the sector is collectively embarking on early digitalization, use of IoT, adopting digital twin and e-connectivity, etc. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Wing Sun. I think the industry has shared various challenges and opportunities, which quite clearly requires governments and international bodies to provide support. But before I ask Lei Hoon to share on what the government can do, perhaps I would like to specifically ask Andres to talk a little bit more about the levy that he has mentioned. It is noted that in Secretary General Lim's opening remarks, he also mentioned about IMO initiating a market-based measure in order to incentivize the use of green marine fuels. Perhaps I could ask Andres to elaborate a little bit about the levy and how it can help in accelerating the decarbonization of international shipping? Andres, please.
Right. So I think a levy has two sides to it. One is penalty and one is incentive. And if you increase the cost of fuel, it's a penalty, and people can debate, well, how high does it have to be in order to be a real penalty? But you disincentivize further the use of fuel. Where it becomes really powerful is if you can channel that back as an incentive into the industry to do research and development, to do scaling, to build infrastructure, and therefore to decarbonize. And if you get those two together, I think it's very effective. The two most important concepts in a levy or any mechanism is it has to be predictable and it has to be equal. And predictable means that you need to know what you're going to pay, because as a business, we're not going to invest if it's a traded scheme where we have no idea. You look at the European traded scheme, it's been €10 a ton, it's been €30 a ton. It could go a lot higher. I think California went to $200 per ton at some stage. If you have this kind of fluctuation, you don't know how to invest. If you have a predictable price increasing over time, you can calculate it and businesses will invest. And the second and last point was it needs to be equal. It needs to be a global scheme, not a regional scheme, because otherwise you will get so many distortions and it will become very difficult to enforce and to police, and it will be unequal across different businesses and across the industry. And what really worries me what I like about what Europe is doing is that it is creating momentum and pressure. And we need pressure to move, so that's great. What worries me is it's neither predictable nor is it equal. And I think that means it's fundamentally flawed.
Oh, thank you very much again, Andreas. I think very clear points from the industry. Time is running out. I would like to give the last word to Lê Hun. Lê Hun, you have heard from the industry about challenges and opportunities, what is required for decarbonization of international shipping. I would like to ask you to share what the Singapore government, specifically the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore, is doing to encourage and facilitate the movements towards decarbonizing shipping.
So there are quite a number of initiatives we're embarking on, but before that, I just want to say that we like challenges conveyed by the industry, because there are challenges. It is the job of the government and the regulators and the promoters, developers to come in and work together with them. In fact, I was just going to say that both Wing Sun and Andreas have mentioned are indeed opportunities for the government to come together and work together. So standards, definitely, I think is an area we want to work together on with other port authorities. When it comes to carbon mechanism, I think it's an area where whoever has the expertise should come in and chip in as well. For example, in Singapore, we have already a carbon levy that's fixed on the industry. And on specifically on how do we bring the timeline shorter, right? It really is about whether putting in place funds and incentives to be able to sort of accelerate some of the process, including the pilot project. So we do have our Green Future Fund, which Minister has mentioned earlier. In particular, I think what we've done really well is to set up the International Advisory Panel, which is really gathering a range of C-suite executives who are able to come in and curate and also collaborate on concrete collaborations. And I have to thank my two co-panelists here for co-chairing the session. So I'm looking forward to working with the industry to see how we can bring this process forward. And last but not least, I think during the beginning of the decade, we talked about IMO 2020. How it's the biggest challenge for the industry, and we have overcome it. So I actually would like to urge the industry that we actually take this as an opportunity. More importantly, as what Wing Sun mentioned, it is a time to transform our industry, and actually even more importantly, it is the time where we can go out and reach out to a different group of talent who can come into our industry and help us transform with special expertise that they have, which we are lacking and which we want to build up in the industry, which includes data, which includes IT, which includes people who knows what IAP is about, IoT is about. We want expertise who are in the environmental sector, green technology. So I see it as a real great opportunity for us to transform this industry in the next few years, next a decade or 2 decades. So I'm actually quite excited about it. Yeah.
Regretfully, I have to bring this very interesting discussion to a close. I would like to thank Lei Hoon, Andreas, and Wing Sun for their thought-provoking reflection and ideas. I think this can better inform the next steps towards achieving the IMO's 2050 goal. And of course, they will come back to respond to any questions at the later session. Thank you very much again. Now, in the same vein, we now have our next presenter representing GTZ, a coalition aiming to get commercially viable deep-sea zero-emission vessels into operation by 2030. Johanna, please.
Yes, thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to join this esteemed session here today. I'm so honored to be part of this this cohort of speakers, and I'm particularly excited about the optimism and the sense of urgency that that has emanated the discussions so far. I mean, I think I'm an optimist by nature, but the glass is not only half full, it is virtually brimming and overflowing with intention, and I think that's what we need to drive us forward on this pathway to decarbonizing shipping. I think the other reason I'm especially pleased to be part of this webinar is that it's at the heart of what the Global Maritime Forum, of which I'm a managing director, is all about. We founded the Global Maritime Forum 3 years ago with the idea that some challenges are simply too big for any one person, any one company, any one government to solve. They require all parts of the maritime system to work together across silos, to come up with solutions that will work in practice. And I guess it's fair to say that decarbonizing maritime trade is exactly such a challenge. I'm probably going to skip pretty quickly over this next slide, as the esteemed colleagues on the panel earlier and the Minister and Secretary General Kitak Lim have already articulated clearly the scale and the urgency of the challenge we face. But I think what's useful to just dwell on a little bit is exactly that urgency that that Lei Hoon so clearly brought across, and which is really what motivated us to establish the Getting to Zero Coalition together with our partners at Friends of Ocean Action and the World Economic Forum. And it's also the sense of urgency which forms the basis for the coalition's mission: to work together to get zero-emission vessels operating along deep-sea trade routes by 2030. Another key aspect that was highlighted by earlier speakers, and particularly by Minister Ong, is that this challenge, it extends far beyond shipping. At the launch of the Getting to Zero Coalition, the CEO of the Port of Antwerp said, shipping's decarbonization starts on land. And since then, we've had some analysis done for the coalition by our knowledge partners at the Energy Transitions Commission and at UMass, which estimates that upwards of 85% of the cost of shipping's energy transition will in fact be in land-based infrastructure and production facilities for low-carbon fuels. And so involvement of the energy sector is absolutely critical. And so that is also reflected in the membership of the Getting to Zero Coalition and how we've built it up. So I think it's also important to highlight that the focus of the Getting to Zero Coalition is on transformation, recognizing that technologies that improve energy efficiency are, of course, indispensable. Less energy we need overall, the less expensive the transition is going to be. But the focus of the Getting to Zero Coalition is on transformation, on scalable zero carbon options that will meet the energy needs of international shipping in a carbon constrained world, because that's the direction we're traveling in. And so we should prepare for that. So that's really where we focus our efforts. And that kind of systemic transformation can only really be achieved through really close collaboration and deliberate collective action between all these different stakeholders. I think some of them were already mentioned: maritime, energy, infrastructure, finance, governments, international organizations such as the World Bank, from whom we will hear later today, etc. I think the good news is that it also represents a $1 trillion market opportunity for the suppliers of zero carbon fuels and associated infrastructure. Even more importantly, and Andreas alluded to it already in his remarks, is that the energy needs of shipping actually are big enough, substantial enough, that shipping has a potential to be a catalyst that brings scale to the deployment of zero-emission fuels for a much broader energy transition across a whole range of sectors that are facing exactly the same challenges that the shipping sector is facing right now, and thus unlocking the market for those fuels all of these other industries. So that's a really exciting opportunity. So the Getting to Zero Coalition was launched almost exactly 1 year ago, at about a week from now, at the UN's Climate Action Summit in New York. We were pleased to say that the UN Secretary General's climate action team remain as supportive now as they were then. In fact, the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, will join the Global Maritime Forum's virtual high-level meeting next month as an expression of that support. And I think therein lies also an opportunity, which is that there are international institutions, there are governments around the world that are looking to support the sector in making that transformation. We depend critically. It's a critical sector on which so many countries and all of us as humans depend. And so there's a tremendous amount of goodwill to help make this transition possible. And that's something that we're going to be calling on over the coming decade, I believe. So it's good to know that there's somewhere to start. We are at present, the coalition encompasses close to 150 engaged and active members from across all of these different sectors, and with the wonderful support of knowledge partners, governments, international organizations, and several of whom are here in this session today, including the Micronesian Center for Sustainable Transport, from whom we will hear next, as well as the World Bank, from whom we will hear later today. So it's an incredible honor to work together with all these knowledgeable and engaged partners in the Getting to Zero Coalition. So what are we actually doing? That's a great question. Well, the work is organized in 4 work streams, each led by a small team of industry leaders, knowledge partners, and supported by a project team. The first work stream is focused on a challenge that Lei Hoon articulated, which is how do we get the first large-scale ecosystem sort of size demonstration projects off the ground. They are going to be critically important to build trust in new technologies, new fuels, to demonstrate the business case for zero-emission shipping, and ultimately to create enough scale to start bringing down the cost of zero-emission fuels. So these are really, really important to help us reach that kind of a later diffusion stage. But at this first stage, we need large-scale demonstration projects. And so this workstream is really focused on how do we make that happen. At our most recent coalition workshop, which took place a few weeks ago as a virtual workshop, this workstream presented a draft blueprint for first movers, is what we're calling it at present, that details potential policies, demand drivers, funding mechanisms, etc., to de-risk and ultimately get these projects to happen. We expect the blueprint to be published later this year, likely in November, and it's already being used as a starting point for how to form groups of stakeholders that will work together on getting the projects to actually happen. The second work stream is focused on fuels, technologies, and transition pathways. And here we're really focused on sort of narrowing down the technology and fuel options, as well as mapping out what implications that has for safety on board, for guidelines, for required regulations, et cetera, as we look to scale up these new fuels. The third work stream is focused on how to close the price gap between conventional and zero emission fuels. And Andreas already spoke quite well about, that's quite a significant gap, and we need something in place to bridge that gap. And ultimately for these new fuels to be cost competitive and see mass uptake over the coming decades. This could be, of course, in the form of a carbon tax, which Andreas rightly advocates for. But there are other tools in the policy toolbox. For example, fuel mandates that have been really effective in the automotive sector, measures regulating the operational emissions from ships that if they're stringent enough, they could drive the uptake of zero emission fuels, etc. There are also other levers, such as conditional finance, premium markets, that likewise could help the diffusion of zero emission fuels. I think one thing that we're also really mindful of, and why we're excited to have Pete in this session here today, is that whatever system is put in place, it needs to be equitable, and it needs to make sure that nobody gets left behind in this transition. And so that's just that's incorporated in this work as well. And then there's a fourth work stream, which focuses on the opportunity landscape for zero carbon fuel exports. This is done at the highest level of government, and often not in the departments for transport, but rather in a Ministry of Energy, for example. So concretely, most recently, we've facilitated discussions between maritime, energy, and financial sectors with both the Chilean Ministry of Energy and the Moroccan Ministry of Energy, both countries with immense potential to produce and export zero carbon marine fuels in future. Thankfully, they have seen that opportunity and are looking to engage with the shipping sector and the energy sector to take advantage of that potential. Andrew from the World Bank is going to dive deeper into this topic in his presentation. So I'm not. I think I'll leave it at that. He'll be able to speak much more eloquently about that potential at a global scale. And well, I guess that just leaves me with an invitation. Join us. Join us in making this transition happen. We've created the Getting to Zero Coalition as an open platform. We wish to collaborate with others that are working together in tandem with us on this challenge and on this opportunity. We want to make sure that we make the most of our collective resources, that we're not duplicating efforts, but rather that we're aligning our efforts, that we're learning from each other, etc. So join us and work with us. That's really the message that I would like to get across here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Johanna. Certainly an exciting major collaboration initiative involving a multitude of stakeholders that would advance international shipping towards achieving IMO's 2050 goal. Up next, we have two presenters from institutions in the Pacific Islands who will share with us the efforts of one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from shipping. First, we have Peter. Peter, please.
Evening, Yakwe, and greetings to you all. Hard act to follow, Johanna. I'll do my best. So let me first thank our hosts for the opportunity to present on the theory of change that we've been building here in the Pacific over the past decade. I'll use a few slides to tell this story. Great to hear tonight of all the new initiatives that IMO has planned for rollout. I'd like to tell you about some of the work and partnerships that are already underway in regions such as ours. Our work originates with two international conferences we organised in 2012 and 14, and the first call to establish a dedicated research centre to drive a Pacific decarbonisation agenda at speed and scale. The Pacific Blue Shipping Partnership, a Marshall Islands and Fiji country-led call for $500 million in immediate blended finance investment, is the result of a decade of sustained work. But first, let me briefly overview the work of the Micronesian Centre for Sustainable Transport. MCST is a legacy of one of the Marshall Islands and the Pacific's great climate champions, the late Tony de Brum. Sorry, I'm losing my slides here. In preparing for Paris in 2014, de Brom was acutely aware of his climate vulnerable country was host to the world's third largest registry, and this presented an opportunity to extend the 1.5 degree agenda to the IMO. Consequently, we were instructed to build capacity of a coalition of Pacific Island Britain states around an initial submission to MEPC 68 in 2015. It's been a remarkably successful experiment. The Pacific has consistently demonstrated its ability to deliver disciplined and constructive role in the IMO emissions work since. We continue to provide research, technical, legal and logistical support to the Pacific High Ambition delegations and their partners. And as the SG noted on his historic visit to the Pacific, our delegations have punched well above their weight and act as a powerful change agent. It hasn't been an easy task. There are some systemic issues within the IMO structure that significantly impede the representation of SIDS and LDCs. Historically, we are seriously underrepresented in these important and critical debates. De Brom was highly aware of the need for our small Pacific states to match step the global change or be increasingly disadvantaged. A successful transition can leave none behind, and so our remit covers two dimensions: support for international advocacy and a Pacific-facing challenge of effecting a domestic transition at speed and scale. We are tasked with implementing the MCST framework, a long-term strategy to transition Marshall Islands to zero-carbon transport, and in doing so act as catalyst for a wider program of transition in neighbouring Pacific countries. 2014, MCST has initiated a range of projects, again with a broad partnership, and I just want to run you through some of our outputs. So we provide knowledge portals to and from the Pacific with global partners, in this instance UNCTAD. We have published and presented widely on cutting-edge collaboration with leading multidisciplinary researchers and analysts globally. We research new build and retrofit technologies and operational practices, including a wide range of technical and design solutions at various representative Pacific vessel sizes from village scale up. This includes the Cerulean project, a public-private partnership with Swire Shipping. While still in its research phase, this project is already demonstrating the high potential of combining industry, government, local and international researchers and experts in the search for practical solutions. We are engaged in emissions modelling, country profiling, national decarbonisation policy development at country level. With our partners, we're preparing new ship designs with leading design shops in Europe. We work on cultural and heritage revitalisation of sailing cultures. Our researchers are currently preparing priority project pipelines in multiple Pacific countries. We are knowledge partners with Getting to Zero and the Pacific Hub for the International Windship Association. We work on carbon pricing, economic modelling and climate financing modalities. The research is clear. Decarbonisation is as much a financing and insurance problem as it is a technology one. And we invest in education and long-term capacity development in country across the spectrum, including legal, policy and technical research and analysis. Turning to the Pacific Blue Shipping Partnership, announced by country leaders at the United Nations Secretary General Summit in New York last year. This ambitious 10-year program targets the requisite domestic transition in the Pacific and is built on a number of assumptions. The climate crisis requires an immediate financial investment at size and scale and in our countries now. Shipping has been the forgotten sector to date and lags significantly behind other energy users. A scattergun of uncoordinated and small-scale projects simply isn't going to cut it. The program must be country-owned and driven. Top-down, international and regional-led initiatives have not yet shown to be effective in generating a paradigm shift at the scale needed. The Pacific requires a bespoke solution, It isn't a case of simply scaling down international research or initiatives. Our domestic shipping scenarios are unique. The solution must be tailor-made. Access to affordable and appropriate ship financing and insurance underwriting for both public and private operators is the greatest barrier to change. A whole-of-sector approach is needed. It's about more than just the ships, but must include the whole industry and logistics supply chain. Climate financing presents a unique opportunity to transition our domestic fleets from a current dependency on old, poorly maintained ships to new and efficient modern shipping. So what's the investment ask? It is built around national action plans of participating countries, a ministerial council responsible for leadership and coordination of the partnership, concessional loans grant investment in low-carbon maritime sector vessels and supporting infrastructure, a dedicated revolving finance facility for small to medium-scale enterprises in participating Pacific countries, and a research and capacity hub through which the Pacific's diversity of national and regional agencies, together with leading international institutions, collaborate on a wide range of technology development, concept, practical training and capacity building programs that underpin long-term success. That success will hinge on building in-country capacity and strong regional and international support partnerships. We already work closely with multiple international knowledge partners in academia, industry and research centres. It will require donors, investment banks and bilateral partners, acknowledging that this sector has been significantly ignored in Pacific energy decarbonisation response to date, and that a paradigm shift in resourcing priorities is now required. As with Johanna's presentation, it's all predicated on an all-willing partners approach. All are welcome, and we've already invited IMO and others to articulate how their programming and initiatives can support this country-driven paradigm shift. We look forward to their and your response. Thanaka whakalevu.
Thank you, Peter. Next, may I invite Jens? Jens, please.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me, and good morning, good day, and good evening. It's a pleasure for the Pacific community to be here with our partners. First of all, I would like to tell you a bit more on the regional context in the Pacific and to add on to what my colleague Peter Nuttall has just covered. The Pacific is one of the world's most disaster-prone regions, and climate change is an existential issue for us. So it's important to realize that we therefore take a single integrated regional framework on climate change and disaster risk management, the framework for resilient development in the Pacific. And this FRDP framework provides high-level strategic guidance to different stakeholder groups, and is the most relevant to us. The most relevant goal in this FRDP to us is goal number 2 on carbon development. So the fact is that in the Pacific region as a whole contributes only 0.03% of the world's total greenhouse gas emissions. Yet we are amongst the most vulnerable to this effect. However, we endeavor to further minimize our emissions. So in 2010, the energy, transport, industrial sectors together accounted for over 3/4 of our total energy demand. So the greatest opportunity for reducing greenhouse gas emissions are in electricity generating, and what we're talking about here is the transport sector. So the strategic objective, under goal number 2 of the FRDP is therefore more efficient and end-use energy consumption and reducing carbon intensity of development processes. I guess this is a very convoluted way of saying that we want to set ourselves on a net zero sustainable development pathway. I also briefly want to mention the framework for action on transport services that we have. It expires this year, but this FATS includes 7 themes, such as safety, connectivity, etc. And for us of relevance is theme number 5 on environmental impact, technology and energy. The expected outcome here is a long one. I wouldn't read it, but it's around the optimal use of transport. So these are the frameworks that govern that guide us in the Pacific in this space. So I hope that the previous slide has helped you to set the scene and to explain why the Pacific region recognizes that all the issues affecting ship the Pacific are interlinked, and that it includes safety, security, and efficiency. So let me dive a little bit deeper into our specific approach. For many countries in our region, domestic shipping is the singular means of access to markets, schools, and hospitals. This means that there's a heavy reliance on maritime transport services to meet social and economic needs. How persistent issues still affect inter-island shipping, and these need to be taken into account in regional and national initiatives, and also in those that around energy efficiency. We can't see efficiency as a singular issue. So we have a lack of safety management and safety awareness. So there's still a clear need to instill a culture of safety, and also that safety at sea is a right for our communities. There's inefficiency of domestic transportation system in responding to community needs. So too often, because there's a lack of governance and sometimes even political interference, there's a lack of accessibility to shipping service groups, particularly women and youth. And there's a lack of energy management in ships and shore, and that's our topic of discussion as well. So what are we doing about these? What are we doing about this? What's our approach? So in consultation with our members, the Pacific Island countries and territories and partners, during the regional domestic ship safety forum that in collaboration with the IMO and hosted by the country of Papua New Guinea in 2018, all representatives called to adopt an integrated approach to shipping towards safe, green, efficient, and accessible domestic shipping services in the Pacific. And this was also echoed at the 4th Pacific Regional Energy and Transport Ministers meeting in Samoa 2019. So we have to recognize that this is an important step forward that would ensure an integrated approach to addressing shipping issues in our region, including that of decarbonization. This next slide shows how we integrate this approach on the ground in the Pacific. As I've said repeatedly now, and above all, domestic shipping services must serve the sustainable mobility of people and goods in our region through safety at sea, protection of the environment, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and responding to community needs. So including providing opportunities for all, including women and youth, and these are critical aspects of our integrated approach. So largely, the approach that we are taking is therefore of a community-centered and participatory approach. So as you see at the Pacific community, we implement several projects supporting such an approach. And may I take my last minute to highlight them and also mention our supporting partners. So in terms of safety, SPC, the Pacific community, implements the Pacific Islands domestic ship safety program that focuses on safety management. This is supported by New Zealand, and so New Zealand is a very strong partner in the region for maritime safety. SPC also has a Green Pacific Ports initiative that looks at improving operational energy and environmental management, and we already have promising results with 2 pilot projects in terms of greenhouse gas emissions at the port level. And SPC collaborates with our regional sister organization, the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, SPREP, to host the Maritime Technology Cooperation Center in the Pacific, the MTCC Pacific. And this supports green shipping in the Pacific. And the MTCC Pacific, as you know, is funded by the European Union and implemented by the IMO. And finally, similar to most of the projects implemented in the Pacific and at the Pacific community, we mainstream gender issues in all project activities. So we now have a wonderful and very active network of Pacific women called PACWIMA in our region that does a lot of work to ensure that ships are safe and the maritime sector has an increasing opportunities for women. So thank you for your attention, and I trust that I've been able to give you a glimpse of our partnerships, our experience and expertise in supporting our members that want shipping to be safe, green, efficient, and accessible to all. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you, Ian. Both Peter and Jens have clearly underlined the resolve and the strategy of the Pacific Island states with various initiatives to decarbonize shipping in the Pacific, as well as the support that they need in their endeavor. Before we go into the Q&A session, a final presentation from the World Bank. Andrew, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Yes, today I would like to speak to you about the opportunities that decarbonization represents for development around the world. Just trying to get my clicker working. Before I begin, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce myself. The World Bank is a relative newcomer to this forum, and many of you may never have seen me before. My name is Andrew Losas. I'm a senior sustainable transport specialist at the World Bank based here in Washington, D.C., where the city is just waking up. I am an engineer. I'm a former naval officer, and I've been working in the maritime and climate change and sustainable transport sectors in different ways for about 25 years. I am leading a number of the World Bank's efforts on maritime transport and the blue economy, including on decarbonization, but also including some of our environmental and climate-related efforts to build partnerships in the port sector and with the countries that host the world's major ports. Today, I'm going to take you quickly through the efforts the World Bank is making to support the decarbonization of this industry as an important development issue, because we are a development bank and we consider this not only climate change, but also the maritime transport industry to be important issues for development. This nautical quote from Saint-Exupéry is useful in, let me read it for you. If you want to build a ship, don't drum up people together to collect wood, and don't assign them tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea. It's a quote that is intended to be inspirational and useful in pointing out the importance of talking about inspiration. If we want to build a climate-friendly world, then let's not start with the nuts and bolts of building it, but let's start with what inspires us to build it in the first place. I would like governments and companies in developing countries to look to the horizon of a carbon-free future for shipping and get excited about being part of that story. Developing countries face a raft of challenges for which they are always searching for solutions, and an energy transition in this industry offers ways to meet those challenges while also providing benefits to the countries themselves. Many of the previous speakers have alluded to this. They've talked about the great level of challenge that we face, but every challenge also contains an opportunity, and I think it's very important that we retain that message and that we remember that opportunities are what we are here to talk about. Opportunities are what we need to advance the development of these countries and to eventually crack this knot or cut the Gordian knot of climate change that threatens all of our development. We've seen the analyses from the World Economic Forum and the Global Maritime Forum earlier this year that show there's a tremendous amount of potential here for the world, somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion worth, of which nearly 90% will be on the land side, and some, though not all, will be in the developing countries. That potential can be harnessed to help developing countries meet their challenges, such as energy independence, progressive international policy, modern infrastructure, and sustainable development opportunities that also create employment and economic growth. So there are many to think about in this situation. I just wanted to provide you a little bit of an overview at the moment of what the World Bank's program looks like in this, in the transport and maritime transport and blue economy sphere. We have a number of projects that are beginning to be developed on a regional basis. We have a blue economy strategy, which is an analytical effort that is being supported for the Pacific Islands, also to include cooperation with the Pacific Blue Shipping Partnership. There is a coastal management project of approximately $400 million in India that has a room to integrate ports and decarbonization as well. An effort, and then there are to create communities of practice and cooperation between riparian countries. So we have the Blueing the Black Sea, which groups 6 riparian countries of this enclosed sea to a regional project to address some of the environmental challenges faced there. And it's also similar to a technical assistance project that we are currently undertaking and that I'm leading in West Africa, called the West African Coastal Area Sustainable Ports Partnership, an attempt to build a cooperative partnership between the ports of 19 countries to understand and then make a progressive, forward-looking motion towards improvement of their environmental and social sustainability, including decarbonization. And finally, in Morocco, you've heard Johanna already mention the possibility of generating green fuels for marine and other applications in Morocco, which is a world leader in renewable energy. That's something that we are also looking at supporting through the World Bank. And finally, we also have, beyond these individual projects in specific countries or regions, we have global engagement, and that's what I would really like to speak to you about today. We are active participants in the Getting to Zero Coalition. We are growing our cooperation with the IMO, from whom you heard earlier, on these matters. And one of our first antes into that game is a decarbonization project, an analytical study and advisory project funded by the Global Program for the Blue Economy, known as ProBlue, also hosted by the World Bank. And that's what I would like to talk to you about more in detail. So this analytical study on the decarbonization of shipping has really 3 components. We heard several people talk already today about the need for an emphasis on small island states or large ocean states and the least developed countries. A workshop series was held earlier this year on specifically this point, and we intend to deepen that capacity building effort as we continue in this program and as we find more resources to do so. We're also working on a transport cost database in partnership with UNCTAD to help fill some of the data gaps to inform the policy dialogue, particularly about impact on states of regulatory measures that might be made at IMO. But what I'm going to talk to you about today and give you some of the preliminary results from is that we have 2 decarbonization studies under this. One is examining the role of LNG as a transition fuel, which I will not discuss in detail today, but the one I want to concentrate on is the one at the top, the zero carbon fuel supply study. So for the remainder of my presentation, I'll focus mainly on that one, as that is where we find the analyses that are most relevant to finding and seizing opportunities for our client countries in the developing world. Our study first reviews the available research on the available options for low and zero carbon bunker fuels. Considering a range of factors, our study concludes that the most realistic potential for the long term, and we are very cognizant of the fact that we're talking about the longer term here, lies in blue and green hydrogen and or ammonia synthesized from that hydrogen. These hydrogen and synthetic non-carbon fuels that you see highlighted in the slide here. With that conclusion, we then considered the potential of all countries worldwide to produce these 4 fuels, meaning e-hydrogen and e-ammonia generated from that hydrogen, or natural gas derived hydrogen, also known as blue hydrogen, and ammonia derived from that. In order to create a global ranking or assessment, what we did was we developed a first set of assessment criteria, which you see here before you. The first and most important, this slide shows you their relative weightings. The most important is the presence of energy resources. If a country doesn't have access to large capacity of required renewable energy resources or natural gas in one way or another, then it's not going to become a fuel supplier of these fuels in the future. So that is a 50% of our weighting. The second most significant was the shipping volumes of the given country, which we weighted to 20%. This is important, especially at the beginning of the transition when proximity is more important. A country could leverage its current shipping volume to serve the ships that call it in its ports with these green low and zero carbon fuels. In the third tier, we have the geographic location related to the one I just mentioned, but the geographic location of a country relative to the network of bunkering hubs that other speakers today have referred to is really it is an advantage, but is not necessarily a prerequisite for becoming a major producer or exporter. So we assigned this into a third tier of importance, along with the regulatory framework of the country in question. It is important, it is relevant for a country to have a regulatory framework that can handle the kinds of public-private partnerships necessary to make these large investments, to produce these fuels, but it is not necessarily a prerequisite at this point, as these things could be developed. So we placed it in this third tier. And finally, at 5% relative weighting is existing infrastructure. Some countries have a bit of an advantage in having existing infrastructure, which indicates a favorable conditions for future investments as well. We've assigned this a 5% weight. And so the result of that, the study develops a composite score for each country's potential in each of the green and blue fuels. These 5 criteria that I've just explained to you. The results constitute a global survey of the potential to produce low and zero carbon bunker fuels. And here before you, the study is not yet published, but I'm showing you a bit of a preview of the conclusions of the assessment that we have conducted with these 2 heat maps. On the left, you see the potential for countries to produce e-ammonia and e-hydrogen for shipping in a 2030, 2050 timeframe. And on the right, you see the same potential, but reflected for blue ammonia and blue hydrogen derived from natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration. I want to make very clear, the notice at the bottom of this page is important. The identified potentials do not represent, at this stage, with the analysis that we've conducted, do not represent the relative competitiveness of production cost in these countries. It only represents the existence of those 5 criteria, the base criteria for the potential simply to produce these fuels. Relative cost competitiveness will have to come in future analyses. We're not there yet. But here you can see that these are the best potential countries: high potential in dark blue, moderate potential in medium blue, and low potential in the lightest. For e-ammonia and hydrogen, we've concentrated, we identified that at least the top 3 among the developing countries: to India, Mauritius, and Malaysia. And then on the right, for the blue corresponding category, we have also added Brazil. Malaysia falls in both. That's an interesting one, and we are looking forward to future study to deepen these analyses and to engage with these governments to see what can be done to realize those potentials. And so now that we have that very first preliminary cast, what is our next step? Well, the next step is to try to turn that into concrete investments and concrete progress. We are now planning a second stage of funding to continue this work, to begin serious dialogue on the basis of this work. It has been somewhat delayed because of the effects of COVID on our program, but we're doing the best we can to compensate for that. We intend to deepen both the global scale work, so further analyses of this kind, as I've already alluded, and the country level engagement with specific countries that have been identified or that have identified themselves as being willing to participate in this initiative. A big part of that will be seeking first mover countries and private partners to begin producing and building coalitions to promote investments in green and or blue bunker fuels. So that's essentially where we are today. Some of the possible candidates you see identified on this map: we've got Mexico, we mentioned Morocco, there's Indonesia, and I have RMI and Fiji representing the Pacific Blue Shipping Partnership also here as well. But then the question marks are pertinent because we don't know who else might wish to join in this conversation or might wish to be among the first movers. So that's what we're searching for right now, as well as looking to the other side as to who the investors might be and the industrial and technological partners who could help to make this a reality. So I think I will stop there. Thank you very much to all of you. It's been an honor to be involved in this, and I look forward to discussing this with you in the Q&A and to a further conversation beyond just this webinar. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for sharing with us the important work that the World Bank is doing and facilitating in decarbonizing shipping, in particular on the production of zero carbon fuels. We will now move into the Q&A session. We will be joined by all the speakers, as well as Ralph from the IMO. Now, we have received a number of very interesting questions, and I must apologize upfront that we are unlikely to have time to answer all these questions. I'll go ahead and post the first question. And on this question, I would like Johanna, Andreas, Peter, and Jens to answer this question. I think we have all heard about the various collaboration initiatives for maritime decarbonization by the GTZAC, by the Pacific Islands. So a specific question that has been asked, and I think this has been referred to by Johanna, is what are your thoughts on the need for incentives for first movers or early adopters, and what more can be done in this area? And I think linked to this, of course, is also about how we can further increase synergies to enhance collaboration and drive innovation to achieve the deliverables. So may I ask Johanna first to respond to this question? Johanna, please.
Yes, thank you so much. And it's a great question. And actually, frankly, Lei Hoon already responded or has answered the question in her remarks earlier in the panel, to be honest. I think the big thing that we see is how do we get those first big ecosystem scale projects off the ground? And for those to be viable, we need all these different stakeholders to work together. They're going to need obviously, the private sector stakeholders need to be a part of that, and that includes both on the shipping side, engine manufacturers, on the energy side, especially fuel producers, et cetera, all of that, ports and infrastructure, all of these stakeholders need to work together. But incredibly important is the important role that governments play in that regard as well. Public-private partnerships is probably the only way that we can get these off the ground, because at this early stage, there's a lot of risk still involved and financial risk involved. It's going to be more expensive than hopefully at a later stage, and so government support and public-private collaboration is going to be critically important. So I think Lei Hoon mentioned that in Singapore there's already excellent work underway on establishing a green fund to support some of these types of projects. We can see other similar efforts underway in other countries, and they come under different headers. So some of them might, so for example, in Japan, Korea, Germany, and other countries, Chile, we mentioned, there's a very forward-looking green energy strategies in place, and those can also support some of the energy production side of these types of projects, but linking the shipping sector into those strategies will be important as well. So lots of public-private collaboration is what we see as critically important to make these projects happen and to get us going, because we need to move fast.
May I just ask you to also speak about the question in relation to the need for incentives for first movers or early adopters?
Yeah, one of the things that we're looking at is, can we, well, there's a couple of different ways to look at it. So there's obviously policy incentives, and those are great. And I think there's a lot of potential also for things to happen at a national or regional level. Not in terms of, for example, like a carbon price, because I think Andreas has made a clear case for why that needs to happen globally, but on the energy side, because so much of the investment is actually on the energy production side, they're bringing down the cost. And so in other words, different kind of policies that could support and lower the cost of the energy production and thus the fuels for shipping would be very helpful. But in addition, there are also other mechanisms that have to do more with sort of demand. We label them demand drivers, but it's basically getting customers to pay more. Again, Andreas made the very good point that that it's, shipping largely has been turned into sort of it's commoditized, right? But there's a premium value attached to zero emission shipping, and so it should be priced at a premium. And so to the extent that we can get customers to pay more for a higher value service, that's something that we want to try and make happen and support.
Well, let me move on to Andreas. Again, two questions. One is how do we increase synergies to enhance collaboration and drive innovation? And secondly, on this specific question, on the need for incentives for first movers or early adopters. Andreas, please.
So I'll take the second question first. And to state the obvious, we invest tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars in ships that last for 25 years. So you can lose a lot of money very fast. And I'll just give you a sense of the price gap to be very specific. In the old days, the lifetime fuel cost of a ship was a fraction or a portion of the ship cost. Now the ship cost is a portion of the lifetime fuel cost. So if you take a ship costing 50 million, and it may be 30 million for a product tanker, it's more for a VLCC is 80 million, but the bigger ships burn more fuel. But let's say that it burns 30 tons of fuel per day. And let's say that the incremental cost is $300 per ton. Today, bunkers cost $300. If you look at these alternative fuels, they're much more than double. But let's call it double. The price gap is $300 per ton of fuel times 30 tons a day times 25 years, 365 days a year. That's $80 million. So you bought a ship for 50 million. Your lifetime fuel cost is 160 if you do base and difference, and you're paying 80 million more than your competition. And that is the price gap for a fuel that costs twice as much. That's the number you need to meet per ship. So who's going to pay? And by the way, that 50 million capital cost may be 55 or 60 because you need to build a different type of engine and you need to do all the equipment. So, these are big gaps. And I don't want to sound pessimistic about this because I'm a great believer in human ingenuity and in our ability to solve these problems. But I just want to frame it that, we need a carbon price of $280 per ton of CO2 to bridge ammonia. And if you include engines and retrofitting and so on, we need $400 per ton. And the industry is talking about 70 cents right now. So we have a big bridge to build.
Well, thank you very much.
I won't go to the other question because I want to let other people speak as well. But you asked about numbers, so I'm giving some sense of numbers.
Well, thank you very much, Andreas. May I have Peter to come in on this question?
Thank you, moderator. And a complex and complicated question. So let me first attack the issue of incentive. And I think first we need to clarify what it is we're trying to incentivize. So from the Pacific of our country's climate most vulnerable, atoll states, some of them not more than 2 meters on average above sea level, when we're talking about ambition, the level of ambition we currently have in the initial strategy is simply not going to cut it if we want to survive in a 1.5 degree limited agenda. So what we need to incentivize is actually a level of ambition higher, relatively higher than that's already been nailed down in the initial strategy. And I think the science that has come out since the initial strategy is incredibly clear that the level of ambition must be increased if shipping is to play its fair share of the work that the global community has to do in keeping us under 1.5 degrees. So it's a very big thing that needs to be incentivized. And we are incredibly encouraged looking around the world and working with people like Johanna and the Getting to Zero Coalition, talking to the people at the Norwegian Shipowners Association and the strides that have been made in those innovative centres about what actually could be achieved. And it seems also clear that the ability for the industry to decarbonise by 2050 is a practical reality. It is capable of doing it. So in terms of incentivising, I fully agree with the previous speaker. It's time to move to market-based measures. The IMO, we should have been debating this a long time ago, and we're increasingly concerned that the pandemic means that we're putting off longer and longer the ability to move to that critical debate about how do we bring the financial mechanisms to bear. That's going to be the next thing that's required to incentivise. However, in the meantime, we're hearing more and more from around the world about industry that is moving already and saying that it can achieve this goal by 2050. Pacific faces a major conundrum. We need the world to decarbonise. We can't afford to be left behind. And our shipping needs are unique. We have very, very different shipping scenarios to a large developing country or a large emerging economies. We need a bespoke solution, and that needs to be incentivised as well. So our message, I guess, as always, is yes, can we accelerate ambition? Can we get there faster? And we need to use whatever financial mechanisms are needed to incentivise that to the greatest degree possible. At the same time, don't forget us, and please don't leave us behind.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. Jens, would you like to share us your views?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to approach the answer to this question in a very different way, and talk about how we integrate ship safety and ship energy efficiency. So we've heard speakers mention that operators have a very low margin of profit. And also in the Pacific, a lot of the ships are 20 years old or they're 30 years old, and the owners are actually still paying off the mortgage. So if you approach a ship operator and you talk to them about maybe changing a few things and making it more energy efficient, they're not going to listen to you. So the age of the ship is also not very conducive to install a new technology that might be more energy efficient. So what we do is we come in and we might have very small funds for some pilot projects. For example, installing a photovoltaic system, so a solar system on a ship that can help the ship run their lights whilst at anchor, so they don't have to run the inefficient ship generator. So we tell the operator that we will help them with the solar system on the ship if they implement safe operating procedures and improve ship safety. So the innovation here is that we combine ship safety with ship energy efficiency. So then the incentive here is that they want to get the solar system, but they have to improve ship safety first. So then other ship operators see this, and they see that someone is saving fuel, and hopefully that will be a sort of cascade. So this works in a small island setting, and I'm talking about small island developing states in the Pacific. And it's a way for innovative solutions to become, hopefully one day, everyday practice for everyone. And things like this can be a catalyst for change, and then hopefully it can be replicated on the next ship or the neighboring island. So we're not going to make huge leaps and bounds. We have to make very small steps. So I've given an example of a grassroots approach to the question, to the problem.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you very much. I would now like to move on to the next question. I must say that I'll probably just be able to ask two more questions, and I know that these are the two questions with the most number of votes. And the first one relates to the recent EU Parliament's decision to push for the EU's emissions trade scheme to be applied to shipping. And the question is whether this is unhelpful and whether it undermines the IMO. I know Andreas spoke about this in the panel discussion, but I would like him to come back perhaps to specifically address this question. And if I may invite Jules or Roel from the IMO to also speak to this question. So Andreas, please.
So I think I thank you. I mentioned most of what I wanted to say earlier about predictability, leaning towards a levy rather than a traded scheme. And equality or global nature, leaning towards a global IMO-led system rather than a European one. I think the question, to frame it differently, how do we achieve this momentum? And Andrew talked earlier about the sort of vision and needing to be inspired. How do we get on a war footing with this? We've done incredible things as mankind, as human beings. When there's a war afoot, we produce things in unbelievable record time. We find the resources. We do incredible things, and then in peacetime we get a little bit more complacent and individualistic and so on. How do we get on this war footing on a global basis so that we don't have countries and regions getting impatient and pushing forwards themselves? And one of the ways I think we can do this is just start small. I mean, I made this point about, needing $300 per ton and only offering $2 per ton of bunkers or 70 cents per ton of CO2. And wow, this is such a big gap. But it doesn't matter. Let's just get started. If it's easier for people to accept $2, then let's start with $2. And then let's make it a journey and ramp it up, make it palatable, test the systems, kick the tires, put all the things in place, and let's just get going. Because I think otherwise I can understand the frustration in Europe. It's like, it took you 13 years to ratify ballast water treatment. We don't have 13 years to wait. That's my view. Do it fast so that everybody comes along and we don't have fragmentation.
Well, thank you very much. May I have either Jose or Roel to speak on this question?
Thank you, Mr. Yap. I would pass this question on to my colleague, who will better qualify to answer this. Roel, if you can ask him. Thank you.
Roel, please.
Yes. Hello and greetings from London, and thank you very much, Jose, for passing this interesting question to me. We're obviously, from an IMO perspective, it's difficult to comment on policy making by the European Union, and we obviously follow what's being discussed. We note that the discussions on this new regulation are still ongoing. We've heard this week about the position of the European Parliament, but we know that further negotiations are still ahead with the EU member states before the policy on including shipping in the European emission trading scheme will be finalized. Now, from our perspective, and we've heard a lot about that today, about momentum, engagement, I just want to stress that we've talked a lot about the 2050 reduction objective in the greenhouse gas strategy, IMO's greenhouse gas strategy. But the strategy also includes a list of candidate measures that actually can help us achieving those targets set out in the strategy. And one of those candidate measures is market-based measures. So I think, and some of the speakers actually alluded to that today, we are ready as an organization to have a discussion on market-based measures, global market-based measures. And of course, IMO's, and that doesn't come to a surprise, IMO's preferred option is to have a global regulatory system for a global industry. Now, all of the EU member states are also member state to IMO, and so we're eagerly waiting for proposals on possible global market-based measures to reach us and to have a discussion within the Marine Environment Protection Committee of IMO this year, next year, on proposals related to market-based measures. We have, the Secretary General mentioned that earlier on, we have rescheduled our meetings now and we're going fully virtual. So we hope that we'll also be able to kind of start and restart the discussions on the different measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from ships. In November, we will have the virtual meeting of MEPC 75. In that meeting, we will discuss and hopefully approve a set of amendments to MARPOL Annex 6 to embed in binding measures, as a binding measure, the reduction by 40% of carbon intensity of shipping by 2030. We will also have a discussion in MEPC on the International Maritime Research and Development Board. And that is a concrete proposal put forward by the industry which speaks about a levy that can be collected by IMO and be redistributed among member states in order to boost R&D around the world. And we're very much looking forward at that discussion during MEPC this year. We know that we'll probably have another discussion during the MEPC meetings next year, but nothing, as I said, nothing blocks us of having a discussion on market-based measures. We spoke about momentum, we spoke about engagement. I think the momentum is there. So we're looking forward to receiving concrete proposals on market-based measures, which is, as I said, in line with our strategy to a future session of MEPC to have this discussion at a global level and to work towards a global market-based measure. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Well, thank you very much, Ruel. I'm afraid I have to come to the last question. And the last question is actually posed specifically to Singapore, but let me broaden it to cover generally government and also international bodies such as the IMO and the World Bank. And the question is really how do governments and international bodies enable the development, production, and even the mainstreaming of maritime decarbonization solution, including low and zero carbon energy sources such as hydrogen, ammonia, and so on for international shipping. And I think related to that, how can other stakeholders such as energy providers play a part? On this question, I would like to pose it to Lê Hun, Jose or Roel from IMO, and Andrew from the World Bank. So Lê Hun, please.
Thanks, Yap. So I know time is running out. So in short, from the Singapore government here, Singapore will be the living lab. We have been living labs, for example, when we were first talking about LNG, and I see ourselves recreating the process. 2014, we started an LNG bunkering focus group. 2021, next year, we are ready to receive our bunker tanker and do ship-to-ship transfer. So it takes 7 years. So we should start now. As a living lab, we are going to put in place a vision, and our vision is that we're going to put in place a Maritime Singapore Decarb Blueprint by 2050. As a living lab, we have put in place some funds already for it. Maritime Singapore Green Initiative, whether it's green port, green energy, green technology, we want you to test it here. Thirdly, as a living lab, we are going to work with other industry players to do joint industry projects. We have a few players who have approached us, and we can contribute from the regulator perspective. Lastly, as what we've done with LNG, we will reach out to talk about bunkering standards. It's an initiative I can't elaborate here, but I think it will come into play in time to come. So Singapore will be the living lab. We are ready and we want to, so we wait for proposals to come our way.
Oh, thank you very much, Lê Hun. Jose or Roel from IMO?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Yap. I'll take a quick first cut to that one. Certainly, it is important that we have a global framework to support this through the governments. First thing that comes to my mind in a practical way is actually the next gen that we just introduced to bring everybody together and then discuss what are the challenges, where are the gaps, and how do we mainstream some of these things. A number of projects undertaken by IMO is also helping governments, and also there is a focus in these projects to help the governments to develop the right policies to promote innovation and to uptake technologies and to provide the enabling environment for the government to mainstream this development in those countries. So another way is actually participation in those projects. And of course, IMO has this great Global Industry Alliance, GIA partnership, which is a public sector partnership. And one way to replicate that at the regional and the national level will also be another way of doing it. I will pass it on to Ruel for the last comment if he has anything to add. Thank you.
Yeah, Ruel.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and thanks, Jose, for introducing what we're doing from an IMO perspective to create this enabling environment. And obviously, Joe spoke about the projects, our cooperation initiatives. From my angle, I just highlighted the role of IMO as a global regulator, and in that way, setting the pace or setting really the framework for the discussions. And I think in that context, we're very happy to see that since the adoption of IMO's greenhouse gas strategy, there has been a multitude of new projects, new initiatives coming up to support the uptake of low and zero carbon fuels around the world. And so we take it that our regulatory role plays an important role in that context. I mentioned the discussions that we are ongoing on short-term amendments. We see a lot of support from a group of member states, active member states in IMO, active industry, Singapore being one of them, really driving the organization towards the adoption of short-term amendments. So we're happy to see that. We are also planning to start again or continue the work on the development of the so-called life cycle greenhouse gas or carbon intensity guidelines. That is much needed to support the uptake of those fuels and to create a harmonized legal framework, creating predictability, stability around these carbon intensity guidelines of the different fuels. And maybe to finalize or to finish my intervention, if we look back at the discussions that we've had in the past year on the introduction of IMO 2020, the global sulfur cap, we have seen within IMO, outside of IMO, among industry organizations, among member states, a lot of initiatives in order to facilitate the entry into force of the global sulfur cap. And from our end, we're very positive about how the global sulfur cap has entered into force. The level of compliance is very high around the world. And this really sets a good example of how member states, IMO, industry can work together in order to make this regulatory change or the regulatory changes that we need a success. So we take the example of IMO 2020, the global sulfur cap, and hope that that example shows how we can cooperate, for instance, through the Next Gen initiative towards decarbonization of international shipping. Thank you, Mr. Mulder.
Well, thank you very much. Andrew, you have the last word on this.
The last word. I didn't expect such an honor. Thank you so much, Mr. Yap. Yes, I mean, so we've talked about regulatory measures. Those are necessary to set the playing field. Ms. Kwa was talking about Singapore as a living lab. We need the first movers as well. But in between those two things, I think we need to think about scale. I think we need to de-risk the first movers. So on the one hand, this is something that we need to be able to do is to we're not very good so far at removing technological risk or at mitigating technological risk, but at some point that's going to become necessary given the short timeline that we have. So we need to look for innovative financial solutions, for ways to take some of the risk out of these initial adoptions of these technologies. That's one thing. And then what I said about scale, I mean, I think the only thing that is going to deliver the changes that we're going to need to have an energy transition in this industry is going to be the market. It's going to be the private sector investing the trillions that are needed. Yes, we have to kickstart that. Yes, we have to show the way with first movers. But what I would say is we need to be ready on a programmatic level. We need to get programs ready so that when Singapore or country X or country Y decides to become a first mover and shows the way, creates that living laboratory, creates that learning experience, then country A, B, and C that are waiting in the wings to see how it turns out can be ready to begin to deploy as well. So we need to have programs. We need to do this on a programmatic level. Countries need to have programs within their own borders. There need to be programs to help countries within regions and so on all the way up to scale to the global level. Because we can't afford to have a project by project CDM type application in this field if we hope to make our timetables ready to deploy on large scales. And that will require finance, that will require the regulatory framework. Of course, all these pieces need to fit together. But I just wanted to emphasize the fact that we need to dream big about the scale that we can achieve. I think that is a crucial element that we must not forget. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Unfortunately, time is up. So I will wrap up by pulling together a few key strands that came out from the very interesting discussion presentations as well as speeches from the Minister and the Secretary General. One, maritime decarbonization for combating climate change and a sustainable industry remains a high priority even as we deal with COVID-19. A globally coordinated multi-stakeholder approach across government, the private sector and the academia under the leadership of the IMO is needed. Two, various initiatives to decarbonize shipping involving a mix of stakeholders, even on deep sea zero emissions ships, are already taking place worldwide, and there are more such efforts to harness, facilitating wider information exchange on such projects, programs, and initiatives, identifying gaps, strengths, and opportunities, and expanding connections, networks, and platforms will be useful in advancing collaboration on maritime decarbonization and green marine fuels. And the IMO's Next Gen can build such an ecosystem. Many governments are providing enabling environments, and I note for Singapore putting forth itself as a living lab to progress the development of maritime decarbonization technologies and solutions, and a number of them would need support and assistance. The IMO, other international bodies like the World Bank, and other partners are ready to do their part in bolstering innovation, collaboration, and capacity building. So there is a great opportunity for many pilot trials, including deep sea zero emission vessels using green energy sources. And we look forward to seeing such a ship, even one being tested in the port of Singapore. Let me close by thanking all of you, the 500 participants from 60 countries for joining us. And this appreciation comes on behalf of the IMO and Singapore, the organizers of this webinar. And certainly we hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.